right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show. This is your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. I am joined now by my guest, Wilfred Reilly. He's an associate professor at Kentucky State University. He's also the author of the new book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives, Defining America's School Curricula. I encourage you to go on to PragerU, check out some of his videos. This guy knows what he's talking about when it comes to history, and I'm really impressed by, frankly, Black American history that he teaches about. Let me ask you this, Wilfred. First off, thank you for coming on the show. Really appreciate you coming on. Do we have him?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So good to have you. Good to have you on. Tell us a little bit about your book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, coming out with Broadside from HarperCollins, is my fourth book. The two other major press books with Reilly were Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. And what this book does is look at some of the things that are really common in kind of the American system of education. It sounds dry, but it's not. And ask, is this true? So were Native Americans peaceful? I only touch on this across a couple chapters, but is sex hard to define, or is it a complex thing with many genders involved? Was slavery, I think this was important, unique to America? Was it America's original sin? One that's kind of technical, was the Red Scare sort of an American panic that paved the way for future panics where we didn't catch any communists? And what I find is that the mainstream kind of center-left narrative on a lot of this stuff is extraordinarily wrong. And if I can expand on that for maybe 30 more seconds, the reason this is important is that there's this whole genre of books. There's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is one of the best-selling books in higher education. There's a similar book from the 1619 Project, 1619, sort of a Black history of America. There's a Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a native history of the United States. That old communist Howard Zinn's, a people's history of the United States. And the theme of all of these is kind of, one, this is one of the worst societies in history. And two, no one's telling you this. And if you know it, you're woke. You're part of the educated elite that's aware that we are evil. And I guess what I find when I actually look into the materials that are used in these colleges especially, but used in many of these schools, is that one, obviously, if you unpack their actual sources, we're not the worst culture in history. We're probably one of the best if you look at the Aztecs or the Romans feeding people to jaguars and tigers and so on. But also, two, these ideas, critical theory or radical feminism or something, they're not novel. They're not original. They're absolutely mainstream. Every book that I've mentioned is assigned to your kid in high school. So the question isn't what were the lies that were told in 1950 before those books were assigned. It's what are the lies that are told by those books now? And I think I do a pretty good job of unpacking that, frankly.
All right, man, that's pretty cool. And obviously it's really important because it's funny, Wilfred, I feel like so many young people, listen, I'm an evangelical Christian, and you can, it's the craziest thing you can. And I know everybody has this type of story. Everybody knows a kid that was maybe on what we would say on fire for God or whatever. They go to college, and the next thing you know, they're a flaming liberal. It's phenomenal to me. Even when I consider BLM, Antifa even, but specifically BLM, I feel like BLM had a bigger impact on the Black evangelical church than pastors have for quite some time. Is there? I mean, does that sound right? Do you see this? Am I making any sense? Is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things there. One of them I'll just mention in passing because I certainly have no beef whatsoever with the Black church. But I do think that there's a tendency for people that have that potential for fanaticism. And there's nothing wrong with being on fire for your God or your wife. But people like that almost never swing back to being boring normies. So I find if they're going to change, they are going to go dramatically in the other direction. One of my high school female partners in college ended up cutting off all her hair and dyeing what remained pink and, just going the full radical skater rebel at the time route. And I don't think that was a unique person. I think that a lot of people do that. If you're going to go full radical, silver rings across the hands, you might go full radical tattooed face. I don't have a comment on that phenomenon. But in terms of the why people swing in that other direction, why they don't stay with their original passion, I think the obvious reason for that is that they're entering an environment where the opposing philosophy is going to be about 95% dominant. And I think if you're a Christian or Jewish, or for that matter, Muslim parent, I don't want to present any frightening boogeyman stories here, but it is important to be aware of that. I mean, I'm a member of the university professoriate. I think I'm a good teacher. A lot of us do a good job in engineering or criminal justice or whatever. But if you look at specifically the soft social sciences, sociology, Black studies, things a lot of people might just want to study out of curiosity, the faculty breaks down about 93% to the left and 7% to the right. That's just a fact. I mean, if you go to the data resource website Econ Live, which isn't really challenged by anyone, the last time they polled softer social scientists, about 18% of them identified as Marxists or communists. And I mean, in real life, nobody's a communist. If you go to a golf course or an African-American barbershop or basketball court, you're not going to meet any commies. So, I mean, this is a unique concentration of people. And when you look at Black Lives Matter, when you look at Antifa, which is literally almost a terrorist group, it's the black bloc that fights police, where you find those people outside of a few slum neighborhoods is the campus. So, I mean, that's why you see so many people enter that environment and come out with the shaven heads and the radical tattoos and so on, because you're kind of going into the other side's community, depending on where you go. I mean, you go to Penn State on a football weekend, you're not going to spend a lot of time protesting, but
right.
Be aware of that.
That's smart. College in general. Let me ask you this. Obviously, Kentucky State University, you teach there. There's some people that would say, listen, I didn't go to college with the exception of a couple of years before I dropped out. But some people would say college isn't worth it anymore. I don't think that's necessarily true for the sciences and some of the things, the studies that you mentioned. What's your general take on that?
I mean, I think if you're going to be a lawyer, you got to go to college. I mean, I teach in political science, which in practice is to some extent a de facto pre-law field. I mean, for a lot of these Black and Appalachian in particular men, although we have no bias in either direction, that we send on to some of these top quality law schools around here. I mean, there's no way to get that experience without college. The same thing would be true for people that want to be a registered nurse, an engineer, a doctor. I mean, for that matter, if you want to be a serious farmer these days, which is something pretty big at K-State, we have one of the best agriculture agronomy programs in the world. Same the UK, friendly rival down the road, larger school, of course. But I mean, if you want to manage 200 acres of land, I mean, you're probably going to need a degree. So I definitely think there's a level at which you should be a little skeptical of some of the fields. The studies is a term that's often used. I mean, there are things where if your kid comes home and says, well, I want to get a degree in, vegan self-care, you should probably say, well, you better join that man's army and pay for that. But if you're just going to school and you're getting a degree in criminal justice, I mean, that in practice, that's how you're going to become a member of the brass level of a police force. So be aware that you're going into an environment that's very liberal. But at the same time, I think the last thing we need to do on the right is discourage ambitious young people from going to college. What that would actually do is just guarantee left-wing control of very important institutions like the museums that contain our cultural heritage and so on for the foreseeable future.
And honestly, that's what we've done. So many of us on the right, there's no doubt about it. You're right. We only have a couple minutes left in this particular block. But you're right. We've ceded the institutions to many of those people that are on the left. And obviously, when it comes to academia, when it comes to the arts, I mean, they are so important. That you make a fair point. I don't think college is for everyone, but obviously the studies that you just spoke of, they would make total sense. Again, I'm speaking to my guest. His name is Wilfred Reilly. He's an associate professor at Kentucky State University. He's also author of the new book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narrative Defining America's Schools. You can actually see some of his videos on PragerU. I've literally heard him before on different shows because I know the voice and have always been impressed by his knowledge of the topics, particularly when it comes to political history, Black history, so on, etc. So we have just a minute left in this block. I guess I want to know, maybe maybe you can touch on for the audience before we get to the break, where we're coming up to Independence Day, the 1619 Project. Maybe you can touch on it for 30, 35 seconds, and then we can finish it on the other side, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think it's just one of many kind of quasi-Marxist challenges to U.S. exceptionalism. The basic idea of the 1619 Project is wrong. It's the creation of an alternative Independence Day. What really began this country was us bringing slaves over in 1619. The basic date, though, is incorrect. In 1619, what we brought over were indentured servants, black and white. They weren't slaves yet. We didn't get slaves until the 1650s. And anyway, having slaves isn't what made America unique. What made America unique is declaring our independence from the oppressive, kingdom of Great Britain, becoming a republic. So 1776, not 1619.
We'll be back with more with Wilfred Reilly on the other side. Guys, I want to talk to you about wealth protection research. At the very heart of our democracy lies a principle that we hold sacred. It's free speech. It's the cornerstone that supports every freedom that we cherish. Yet in today's digital age, discussions about our wealth, our rights, and our future are being silenced or overshadowed in mainstream narratives, leaving many feeling voiceless in conversations crucial to our financial independence and security. This is where wealth protection research steps in. They're armed with a mission that's never been more critical. Wealth protection research is not a financial advisory firm. They are defenders of free speech, committed to giving a voice to the silence. Wealth protection research tirelessly seeks out financial experts. These are the voices that challenge prevailing narratives, especially as we navigate the uncertainties of the 2024 election. Wealth protection research has created a 2024 election wealth protection report. This free report highlights the 3 best ideas for protecting and growing your money heading into the 2024 election. It contains ideas the mainstream media won't touch, and listeners can get it completely free. All you have to do is text the word ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy. If you believe in the sanctity of free speech and the importance of financial freedom, act now. Text the word ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy of this 2024 election protection report. It's time to widen the scope of what we're told, to hear the ideas the establishment does not think you can handle, and to take control of our financial destinies. Text ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy. If you text the word ideas today, you'll also get a free gold investment kit from Wealth Protection Research, sponsored by Augusta Precious Metals. All right, hello and welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. Again, I am joined by my guest, Wilfred Reilly. He's an associate professor at Kentucky State University, also the author of the new book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. Before I get back to my guest, I do want to talk to you real quickly about Priority Gold. Economists warn that massive tax hikes could devastate your IRA and 401k. As the stock market braces for impact, with inflation on the rise and the global uncertainty looming, it's clear why central banks and savvy Americans are turning to gold in times like this. Proverbs 21:20 reminds us to preserve what we built. Right now, that wisdom points us towards gold. If you haven't had your eye on gold, time to make it a priority. My name is Carl Jackson, and I urge you to call my friends at Priority Gold to find out how they can help you diversify your savings with physical gold and silver. You can give them a call at 1-800-405-GOLD or visit prioritygold.com/golden for a free gold info guide. Plus, see if you qualify for free shipping and storage. Act now to get your portfolio working for you while the market is golden. Call 1-800-405-GOLD to speak with a gold specialist or visit prioritygold.com/golden to learn more. That's 1-800-405-GOLD. All right, now back to my guest, Wilfred Reilly. Okay, let's get to the nitty gritty. We touched on this on what's going to be a separate podcast here, but I just want to I want to speak to you about some things specifically when it comes to let's say Black history, Black culture, politics, and blacks, if you will. I think this is so important. First off, Donald Trump got a little heat. For something that I think is really silly, but I want to hear your take on it. Black jobs, apparently saying black jobs and the illegal immigrants are threatening black jobs is racist. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think that's just a stupid made up claim. What we've really seen with a lot of the political left, and I hate to say this, but especially the minority left over the past maybe 20 years, has been arguing that virtually anything is racist because there aren't any real examples of racism. I mean, when you go back historically, what are cited as examples of racism would be, for example, the Tulsa race riot, where 13 whites and 26 blacks died during a shootout. I mean, so that's what racism meant. That's what it still means in India today. It means ethnic conflict, violent abuse, tragically sexual assault along racial lines. And today, white and black Americans, I mean, there's some criminals, disproportionately black, unfortunately, that engage in this kind of atrocity, but the average taxpayer would never even consider that kind of thing. So what racism has come to mean is sort of like, you know, he looked at me as I got into the elevator. Both groups do this. You know, what does it mean? And the answer is it doesn't mean anything. The guy had a bad day. Go live your life. Get a coffee. You know, and I mean, and this is this kind of thing like the blacks. Is it offensive to say? No, it's not. So black jobs, the black jobs quote to me was especially absurd because I used to subscribe to Black Enterprise. So the entire magazine's basically called Black Business. This is when I was in business as a black businessman. You might correct me, but as I recall, their hiring section was called Black Jobs. I don't know if that was the formal title, but it's like this kind of stuff. It's just, you could find 100 examples. Like The Root ran a famous piece called "What Does Migration Mean for Black Jobs?" that a couple of my buddies, black and Hispanic, sent me when these comments were made. You can just Google The Root Black Jobs. You'll still find it. So all these people saying, well, Trump said black jobs, we must be the most racist, evil white man ever. I mean, they're just seizing on something that at first glance might look mildly offensive. I'm not offended by it at all. A black job's just a job a black guy has. The real offense, actually, if you want to play these games, would be the party that's moving in. So far, it's 12 million unvetted, mostly illegal foreign residents to take jobs from poor people, because those poor Americans do happen to be disproportionately African American. So I think we should care more about robbing our countrymen than about what they're referred to as during presidential debates. I mean, if I really had to dig down and pretend I have a strong reservoir of feeling about this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I appreciate you saying that. I mean, obviously, those that are in urban communities are going to be disproportionately affected by the Biden's intentional open border crisis. I guess it's not a crisis if it's intentional, but by his open borders plan, or his administration's open border plan. So I do appreciate you saying that. Before we went to the break, we were talking about the 1619 project. Why is it? This frustrates me, because I feel, and we spoke about this earlier, but I'd like you to touch on it again just real quickly. I feel like we had gotten, obviously racism will always exist. There will always be some racist people, but I don't feel like racism in America can stop you. I can tell you, Wilfred, I remember a day specifically when I was working out in the yard and there was 2 white kids that had passed by, 1 Asian kid, 1 black kid. They were all walking together. They had a golden retriever or something. One of them was holding the leash. One of them was dribbling a basketball. And I looked up. This had to be 20 years ago. I looked up and I was like, dude, we made it.
We did it. Yeah.
And now I'm like 1619 project, BLM. I just feel like we've gone backwards, and I don't even feel like these I don't feel like there's I don't want to say there's real racism, but I just feel like so much of this stuff is created nowadays.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with that. So I mentioned in the sort of segment we did for the podcast that when people say that there were 400 years of slavery in the USA that just ended last week, this sort of thing, and I'm only mildly exaggerating, that's 1619 just held the 400th anniversary of slavery as a semi-formal event, which would mean that slavery stretched from 1619 to 2019. I mean, this is to some extent just made up nonsense. I mean, slavery in the United States stretched from 1776, when our country actually began. We were an oppressed British colony in 1619, until 1865, when the integrated Northern Army broke the South against brave and, mal-inspired but heroic resistance, and freed the slaves after conquering the region. And from that point forward, some steps forward, some back, but Deep South segregation was formally ended by Brown v. Board in 1954. Racism was made, or discrimination was made, civilly and in many cases criminally illegal by the Civil Rights Act, 1964. Not to go point by point here, but we've had pro-minority affirmative action in place, at least regionally, since Mr. Nixon's Philadelphia Plan in 1967. So, yes, we have spent an amazing amount of time, blood, and treasure to fix America's racial issues, and we've done so successfully. And it's extremely bizarre that it's become taboo to say this. So, I mean, some data that I mentioned, by the time we'd gotten to the mid-90s, when you had integrated athletic leagues, integrated Fortune 500 corporations, whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics beginning to become a force. You know, I mentioned as a kid arguing about whether Jordan was better than Bird. About 70% of whites and about 65% of blacks thought race relations were good. And over the past 20 years, and especially since the start of Black Lives Matter, what we've seen is an astonishing, what we'd call retrogression in social science. So we've seen those numbers fall back to like 30% of black people, 33%, and maybe 35% of white people. And not to ramble on, but the thing that's crazy about this is that there's no empirical reason for that to have happened.
Yes.
Interracial.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You're right. That, I mean, it's like a flashpoint to me. I'm like, how did that happen? How did you go backwards like that when there was no flashpoint to make that happen?
What happened is that grifters told us that things were getting worse. It's an actual empirical thing. Like you see a little of this on the alt-right too. No excuse for those boys. But the majority of this was on the left. So like there's a guy named Zach Goldberg, who's a really competent young scientist. And what he did was measure the use of what you call provocative terms, things that people will take as fighting words, like white supremacy, you're a white supremacist, racism, you're racist, the patriarchy, all of this stuff in the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, so on. And what he found was that from about 2012, when Barack Obama really needed a unifying message to go against Mitt Romney, up through Trayvon Martin, up through Michael Brown, up through the modern era, when he doesn't try to link all of this, this is my theory, he doesn't try to give a cause for this. But you see an increase of about 1,400% in the use of these terms. And the Times, the Post, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune. So for the American upper middle class, and at the same time, right, like Twitter goes really live, Facebook goes beyond college. So people are suddenly seeing all this crap. They're seeing like Michael Brown and a cop fighting to the death. And they're hearing their media saying, well, there's white racism everywhere. There's black crime everywhere. And it's more focused on the whites, right? Karens, racist, patriarchy. And so people are being told all this, despite the fact that if you look at interracial marriage or something, racism's been declining this entire time. Racism has nothing to do with these increases in crime, which track annually with like the rate of police stops. This whole racism scenario, whole race war scenario is made up by grifters on the political left with a tiny bit of help from the political far right. So it's one of the weirdest stories that I've seen as a social scientist. And exposing that was the point of my first book, Hate Crime Hoax, where I looked at these stories like Jussie Smollett, Covington Catholic,
30 seconds.
And I noticed that none of them were real. They were all just legitimate fakes, like where the police were prosecuting people for filing false reports. So it's a weird story. It's something that's destabilizing the country that's not in most cases real.
All right, you got to go out and get this man's book. Listen, I'm buying it right now. Author Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. I'm speaking of Wilfred Reilly. This is the Carl Jackson Show. We'll be right back. You might have heard Mike Lindell and MyPillow no longer have the support of the big box stores or the shopping channels that they used to. They've been part of this cancel culture, so they want to pass savings directly on to you, my listeners. They have a $25 extravaganza. When Mike started MyPillow, it was just one product, but with the help of his dedicated employees, they now have hundreds of products, some that you may even know about. Obviously, you know about the MyPillow. So here's what Mike is doing to get the word out. I'm inviting my listeners to go to mypillow.com for their $25 extravaganza. They have a 2-pack multi-use MyPillows for just $25. MyPillow sandals are just $25. Their 6-pack towel sets are just $25. Brand new pack of dish towels, $25. So for the first time ever, the premium MyPillows with the all-new Giza fabric are just $25 as well. And orders over $75 receive free shipping. All you have to do to get this amazing offer is go to mypillow.com, use the promo code Carl, C-A-R-L, or give them a call, 800-858-0263. That's promo code Carl. All right, welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. Wilfred Reilly was kind enough to stay with us for one more segment. I asked him to because I think some of the things that he's discussing are very important. I think they are, frankly, I think it's ammunition for those of us that are conservatives. You need to understand why you believe what you believe. You need to be able to fight back. And I'm speaking of as far as arguments are concerned with people on the left, in my opinion, you need to know what you're talking about. One of the ways in which you can do that is to go and get his book. He's the author of Lies My Liberal. I don't know why I keep doing that. Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives, Defining America's Schools. So we talked about black jobs. Obviously, there was a big hoo-ha over that with Trump. We talked about the 1619 project. We talked about how racism seemed to have gotten worse when it didn't make any sense. But also, you talk about in your book, you say here, Native Americans were peaceful people who spent all day dancing. Is that what we should believe? Because that is essentially what we seem to be taught, Wilfred, that Native Americans were very peaceful people. And then basically white Europeans screwed them and stole their land and everything else. So what should we believe? What's the truth?
Yeah, so that's one of the chapters in the book. I'm a good scientific writer, I think, without false modesty, but I'm also fairly funny. Like, we both come from big cities where there's like a long lunch table tradition of sort of banter. And I mean, the title of the chapter, I think the whole title went by the publisher. So it's, natives were peaceful people who spent all day and dancing and making love. And I'm not just making fun of a great ethnic group of people. I'm making fun. In fact, I'm not doing that at all. I'm making fun of a tradition in Western intellectual thought, which has been called the noble savage tradition. So the Skeptic Research Center, which is a great, small, right-leaning think tank, they recently conducted a series of studies of young Americans. And they found that at least among liberals, something like 71% of people think that Native American tribesmen were pacifists who lived peacefully and rarely, if ever, warred with one another. I believe that was the language of their question. And this really influences the kind of media we consume about Native Americans and other quote unquote primitive people, like Pocahontas, Dances with German Shepherds or whatever that movie was called, so on down the line. Like, it's just these people like relaxing, like sitting out on the prairie. There's a show on HBO called Pioneers or something where like one of the daughters of this wagon train just wanders off and during the days peacefully falls in love with a Comanche warrior who'll just ride up and talk to her. And it's just, this is the narrative that's presented through many textbooks as well. And I point out that that's wildly unrealistic. Like, an actual Comanche warrior and the actual white brother of this girl, if they saw each other, would have immediately killed each other with knives. They're existential opponents. The Comanche warrior probably would have kidnapped and raped this girl, not because any of these people are genetically evil, but because whites and natives were fighting a 400-year-long war at the time. I mean, you can't just ignore reality and tell fairy tales, and that to a large extent is what we're doing. So in the chapter, I talk about Native American conflict before the whites arrived. So obviously there were large and civilized native states, but they were states that had developed without the balancing influences of Christianity, Judaism, the Roman Empire, all of the things that existed in the old world, right? So, I mean, the Aztec Empire was literally a cannibal empire. There were annual sacrifices where 50,000 or so captive warriors from other countries like Cholula were killed and eaten. The Aztecs sometimes ate babies. That's just a reality. We talk about the cruelty of the Spaniards who conquered the Aztecs, but the Spaniards to some extent thought they were conquering hell. When they got into Tenochtitlan, they talked about what a great, beautiful city it was, but they also talked about what they thought were temples to devils that had banners of flayed human skin outside them, Game of Thrones style, and towers made of human skulls in front of them. Other native peoples were less brutal than that, but were just what we think of as Viking-style tribal warriors, the Iroquois and the Haida and so on down the line. There's a great article called The Most Violent Time in North American History Was Before Whites Arrived, and I discuss that in the chapter. And I don't criticize the Indians really through all of this, at least at any genetic level. I just say, well, these were people like the Zulus, like the Vikings, who were, the most legendary savages in history. They were just human beings who lived without the religious or legal restraints that the Europeans or the Asians had developed by that point. But it's silly to pretend that people who live like that are saints. They tend to be the exact opposite. So I talk about Native culture positively and negatively, but I think honestly. And that's one chapter of the book. That's chapter 3, as I recall.
You know what? And let me tell you why I think this is so important. Again, go out and get the book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives, Defining America's School Curricula. I'm speaking to Wilfred Reilly, the author of the book and also associate professor at Kentucky State University. I really think it's important for people to understand that people are people, that history is history. And you know, slavery was universal, and violence was the way, quite frankly, of the world. It's amazing to me. We're so civilized. It's as if we project our civilization
almost too civilized.
Onto history, and it's crazy to me.
Yeah, I want to make a quick comment there. So, like, when I was prepping for the book, I did real scholarly research, and one of the things I got to do was look at these old hieroglyphic languages, like Sumerian cuneiform. And I'm not going to like wonk out and talk about this for 20 minutes, but it was really interesting because you got to see what humans really think things are. And like the symbol for marriage in every culture was, you know, let's politely say a heart on the female side being exchanged for, like, on the male side, a house or a sword or a bag of money. And there's a reality there, which is that in relationships, women were expected to bring sexuality and civilization, the chance of a family. And men were expected to bring protection and resources and to have a house for you to wife in. And we've now moved beyond that at some level. We want love too, but it's probably important never to forget those basics. Very few people want an asexual spouse or an unemployed husband, you know, so on down the line. And all of the words for things were of that kind. Like the famous Chinese word for opportunity is like danger and chaos plus a chance. The word for slave just means defeated warrior. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. The word for slave is one of the 20 oldest human words, probably. It comes from Sumerian cuneiform, and it's just the word for man from the mountains with a few changes made to it. So, like, you came down here to the plains, you tried your best, you lost. Now you're going to work on developing your agricultural skills for 15 or 20 years. You know, so it sucks. It's unfortunate. It's good not to be glib that we've moved past that. But for us in our society today, we sometimes forget these brutal realities. In a relationship, especially as a female partner, you want your mate to do things, including generally working. You know, there are consequences to defeat in battle. So we see these crazy things now, like Israel's being asked to feed Palestine while they're fighting a war. No, the other side's losing. They should surrender. You know, I mean, like, it's just, we have become too civilized. So that's why in the West, we're the most civilized of the two civilized countries, although Japan sometimes catches up with their annual birth rate of 0.8 and so on. But I mean, that's why we do things like look at our historical practice of slavery and say, well, nothing could ever justify that. And I think as a clear-headed businessman or soldier or something, you might say, well, one thing could. That was the rule at the time, and everybody had slaves, and the only other thing you could do with battle captives was kill them. And if someone says, well, even machinery didn't exist, but I still disagree, some things are never okay, there's not much you can do with that perspective. That's what's called presentism. You take the moral system of the present day and you extend it to the past, where you say, well, in a society with no jails and no Geneva Conventions that allow you to safely treat with prisoners of war, and for that matter, no advanced machinery, you still shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. I'm very glad we moved past slavery, but the Western obsession with punishing only us for this, or the mistreatment of women or something like that is uniquely bizarre, and it does come from that hyper civilization. The sort of thing that makes us forget what relationships are, or defeat is, or 100 other things like that.
Man, good stuff, man. Listen, I got to tell you, you may have sold me on Kentucky State University. Send your kids there to learn under this guy. All right, so we only have we only have just over a minute left. America is systemically racist, allegedly, and apparently it can't be redeemed.
Well, I mean, so actually I can pitch this into the short ad. So first of all, Kentucky State is always welcoming student applicants. And because America's not systemically racist, we accept Caucasian, Hispanic, and so on students as we are in fact required to do by law because it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. The school's like 30% white. Everyone gets along fine. They all play basketball together and so on. So, but I mean, I think that that's actually the perfect rebuttal, that the black colleges have to accept white student athletes and so on. The idea of systemic racism in that environment comes down to pointing at disparities. People will say, well, there are more whites in the NHL or blacks in the NBA, or there are more Caucasian lawyers or something. What could it be but racism? And the answer is, well, why don't you look at it? Like, what's the test score on the LSAT for whites? Is it higher than the score for blacks? And as soon as you start bringing this up, people start like just basically calling you a racist. You know, I don't know. The test could be prejudiced against black people. And I've written a couple of papers where I've just gone point by point by point through this. Well, it's not. The highest score belongs to Asians. And when you actually get to the bottom of almost every one of these claims, there's never any real racism to be found. That's all I can say. I'm sure there's some out there. We've all met bigots. But no, math tests aren't prejudiced against black people.
All right. Wilfred Reilly, go out and get his book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. We'll be back. This is The Carl Jackson Show.